When I started meeting with Father Nathan for counseling, I was desperate for someone to help me make sense of my life. My marriage had crumbled 6 months earlier, and the life I'd built over 7 years had unraveled in the span of a few weeks. The man I'd thought I'd grow old with had left me for someone younger, someone brighter. In the wreckage, I'd found myself questioning everything. Not just my marriage, but my faith, my purpose, my own worth. I wasn't a regular churchgoer before the divorce. I'd attended sporadically over the years, mostly out of obligation. But after everything fell apart, I found myself drawn to the idea of something steady, something that could anchor me when everything else felt adrift. That's how I found myself sitting in the pews one Sunday morning, listening to Father Nathan deliver his sermon. He was younger than I expected. 29, maybe 30. With a warmth in his voice that made me feel seen even from across the room. His words were gentle, compassionate, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe there was a path forward. After the service, I stayed behind, lingering in the shadow of the altar, until most of the congregation had filed out. When he noticed me, he approached with the kind of calm confidence that made me feel like I could say anything to him, and he wouldn't judge me. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I wasn't sure where to start, so I simply said, "I think I'm a little lost." That was how it began. Our first few sessions were formal, almost clinical. We sat across from each other in his office at the church, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. I told him about the divorce, about how my husband had left me for someone younger, and how I felt like I'd failed, not just as a wife, but as a person. Nathan listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving mine as I spoke. He had a way of making silence feel comfortable, of letting me fill the space without rushing me or offering hollow reassurances. "You're not broken," he said during one of our early sessions. "You're grieving. And grief is messy. It doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're human." His words stayed with me long after I'd left the church that day. Over time, our conversations grew less formal. I started to look forward to our meetings, not just because they gave me a space to unpack my emotions, but because of him. Nathan was kind, patient, and thoughtful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. He asked questions that made me feel seen, like I was more than just the sum of my failures. I didn't realize it at first, but something had shifted. I caught myself lingering in the parking lot after our sessions, hoping to see him again. I started thinking about him in the quiet moments between work and sleep, wondering what he did when he wasn't at the church, what his life had been like before he'd taken his vows. And then one night, everything changed. It was raining that evening, a relentless downpour that mirrored the heaviness I felt in my chest. I'd been sitting alone in my living room, staring at the TV without really watching it, when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there he was, Father Nathan, standing on my porch, his coat soaked through and his expression unreadable. I thought you might need someone to talk to," he said, his voice soft but uncertain. "I should have sent him away. I should have told him it wasn't appropriate for him to be there. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in, the warmth of my home enveloping us both as I closed the door behind him. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to confide in a priest. Growing up, church was something we did out of obligation, a way to mark holidays, a box to check on Sundays. It wasn't a place I associated with comfort or guidance. But after my marriage fell apart, I found myself searching for anything that might offer a sense of stability. I married young. Too young, really. We'd met in college, two idealistic 20-somethings who thought love was enough to weather anything. For the first few years it was. But as time wore on, cracks began to form. He became distant, his attention pulled away by work, hobbies, and eventually, another woman. I didn't see it coming. Or maybe I didn't want to. By the time I found out, the damage was already done. When he left, it felt like he took a piece of me with him. I told myself I'd bounce back, that I didn't need him to define me. But the truth was, I didn't know who I was without him. I threw myself into my work as a schoolteacher, filling my days with lesson plans and grading. But the nights were harder. The silence of my empty home was deafening, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. That's when I started going to church. It wasn't a dramatic decision, more of a whim than anything else. I'd driven past St. Gabriel's 100 times before, but one Sunday morning, I parked my car and walked inside. The air smelled faintly of incense, the kind that lingers in your clothes long after you've left. I slid into the back pew, feeling out of place among the regulars who greeted each other with warm smiles. And then Father Nathan stepped up to the pulpit. He wasn't what I expected. Young, with sharp features softened by an easy smile, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that made you want to listen. His sermon that day wasn't about sin or judgment. It was about resilience, about how even the most broken things can be mended. I didn't know it at the time, but that message was exactly what I needed to hear. Nathan was everything I wasn't: calm, grounded, and sure of himself in a way that felt unshakable. At least, that's how he appeared on the surface. He'd grown up in a small town, the youngest of 3 brothers. His path to the priesthood had been unexpected, even to him. He'd studied philosophy in college, unsure of where it would lead, until a summer volunteering at a mission changed his life. I realized I wanted to do something that mattered, he told me during one of our sessions. Something that made people feel less alone. He'd been ordained 4 years ago and had quickly become a beloved figure in the community. Parishioners spoke of him with admiration, calling him a gift to the church and wise beyond his years. But beneath his composed exterior, I sensed a man who carried his own burdens. When I started meeting with Nathan for counseling, I didn't expect much. I thought he'd offer me platitudes, maybe a few Bible verses, and send me on my way. Instead, he listened. Really listened. He had a way of asking questions that made me confront things I'd been avoiding. Why did I blame myself for my marriage failing? What did I want my life to look like now? Did I believe I deserved happiness? At first, it was uncomfortable, peeling back layers I'd kept hidden even from myself. But the more we talked, the more I started to feel a flicker of hope. I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, he said one day, his gaze steady. You've been through hell, but you're still here. That says something. No one had ever said that to me before. Over the weeks, our conversations drifted beyond my struggles. I learned about his life before the church, how he'd loved hiking in the mountains, how he missed the chaos of his brother's teasing. He confessed that he sometimes wondered what his life might have been like if he'd chosen a different path. I don't regret it, he said, almost as if trying to convince himself. But there are moments when I wonder what I've given up. Those words stayed with me. I don't know when it started, but at some point, our sessions stopped feeling purely professional. I caught myself looking forward to them in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not just because they helped me, but because of him. It was in the small things, the way his eyes lingered on mine a moment too long, the way his voice softened when he asked how I was doing, the way my heart raced when he smiled at me. I tried to push those feelings aside, telling myself it was nothing. He was a priest, bound by vows I couldn't begin to understand, and yet there were moments when I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, of longing, before he quickly looked away. That rainy night, when he showed up at my door, I knew something had shifted. He stood there, drenched from the storm, his expression caught somewhere between concern and uncertainty. I shouldn't have come, he said after I let him in, his voice low. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. About how alone you must feel tonight. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. For weeks, I'd been trying to ignore the connection between us, pretending it was all in my head. But hearing him say it out loud made it impossible to deny. We sat on the couch, the sound of rain pounding against the windows as we talked. At first, the conversation was safe, how I was coping, how I'd been feeling. But then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and said, I've been struggling with something too. He didn't look at me as he spoke, his voice trembling just enough to make my heart ache. I care about you, more than I should, and I don't know what to do with that. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air between us felt thick, charged with everything we weren't saying. Nathan, I started, but he shook his head, finally meeting my eyes. I know it's wrong, he said, his voice breaking. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to say something, anything, but all I could do was stare at him, my own emotions spiraling out of control. When he reached out, his hand brushing mine, it was like a dam breaking. The tension that had been building between us for weeks finally snapped, and before I knew it, he was kissing me. It was hesitant at first, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. But when I didn't, it deepened, his hands tangling in my hair as I clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control. That night, something changed between us. We crossed a line we could never uncross, and even as guilt and doubt swirled in the back of my mind, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I don't know what I expected after that night. Maybe I thought Nathan would act like nothing had happened, that he'd retreat behind his priestly vows and the safety of the church walls, burying the moment between us as if it had never existed. But that wasn't what happened. The morning after, I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, and the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. For a brief moment, I let myself believe it had been a dream. A vivid manifestation of all the emotions I'd been bottling up for months. But when I turned my head and saw the imprint of where Nathan had been sitting on the couch, the memory came rushing back. The way his lips had pressed against mine, hesitant but insistent. The way his hands had trembled when they first touched me, sliding down my arms before pulling me closer. The way the world outside had seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us in that fragile, fleeting bubble. I spent the day replaying every moment in my mind, vacillating between guilt and an ache I couldn't shake. I knew what we'd done was wrong. I knew it broke rules I'd barely understood and crossed boundaries we could never uncross. But knowing didn't stop me from wanting it to happen again. The next time I saw Nathan, it was during Sunday service. I wasn't sure if he'd acknowledge what had happened, or if he'd even look at me, but when his eyes met mine from across the room, I felt the air leave my lungs. He didn't avoid me. If anything, he lingered after the service, making his usual rounds of polite conversation with the parishioners before finding me by the coffee station in the back of the hall. "Claire," he said, his voice steady but low enough that no one else could hear. "Can we talk? Privately?" I nodded, my heart pounding as I followed him to his office. The door clicked shut behind us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He leaned against the edge of his desk, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "I shouldn't have come to your house," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I crossed a line and He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to make sense of this." I took a step closer, my voice trembling. "Nathan," but he shook his head, cutting me off. "No. Let me finish." He looked up at me then, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I know this is wrong. I know I've broken my vows in ways I never thought I would. But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Hearing him say the words I'd been too afraid to speak out loud felt like a dam breaking all over again. That night, he came to my house again. I wasn't sure if he would, or if he'd retreat into guilt and silence, but when I heard the knock at the door, my pulse quickened. When I opened it, he was standing there just like before, but this time, he didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and before I could say anything, his hands were on my face, his lips crashing into mine. There was nothing hesitant about it this time. His kiss was hungry, desperate, like he'd been holding back for years and couldn't take it anymore. I felt myself melt into him, my own need rising to meet his as I tangled my fingers in his hair. He pulled back just long enough to catch his breath, his forehead resting against mine. "Claire," he murmured, his voice raw. "Tell me to stop. If you want me to stop, tell me now." I couldn't. I didn't want to. Instead, I kissed him again, my hands sliding down his chest as he backed me toward the living room. We stumbled together, our movements clumsy and frantic, until we collapsed onto the couch. His hands explored me with a reverence that made my heart ache, his fingers trailing over my skin as if memorizing every inch. When he whispered my name, it wasn't just a sound, it was a prayer, filled with all the longing and guilt and desire we'd both been carrying for weeks. For the first time in years, I felt alive, wanted, seen. When I woke the next morning, Nathan was gone. At first I thought he'd left without saying anything, but then I saw the note on the coffee table, his handwriting neat but hurried. "Claire?" I'm sorry for leaving like this. I needed time to think. I'll see you soon. The words filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. I knew he wasn't gone for good, but I also knew that whatever came next wouldn't be simple. A few days later, he called me, his voice quiet but steady. Can you come to the church tonight, after everyone's gone? I agreed, though my nerves were already frayed by the time I walked through the doors of St. Gabriel's that evening. The halls were empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Nathan was waiting for me in his office, the room lit only by a small desk lamp that cast shadows across his face. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days, but his eyes softened when he saw me. I've been thinking, he said as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. About us. About what we're doing. And, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, his hands finding my waist as he pulled me close. I don't know what this means, he admitted, his voice raw, but I can't stay away from you. Neither of us spoke after that. The weight of our actions hung heavy in the air, but it didn't stop us from giving in to the pull that had drawn us together from the start. That night, in the quiet intimacy of his office, we crossed another line. The church walls that had once felt so sacred now felt like a backdrop to something both sinful and inevitable. What happened between us wasn't just an affair. It was a slow unraveling of everything we thought we knew about ourselves, our boundaries, our beliefs, our ability to resist temptation. Nathan had spent years building a life defined by his faith, by the expectations of the church and his congregation. I had spent months trying to rebuild a life that felt broken beyond repair. Together, we found something we hadn't even realized we were searching for: connection, comfort, and a passion that burned brighter because of how forbidden it was. But as much as we tried to keep our relationship hidden, I knew it couldn't stay that way forever. The weight of what we were doing, the lies, the secrets, the risks, was already starting to take its toll. And deep down I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. After that night in his office, we couldn't stop. We told ourselves we would, of course. Every time we were together, it began with whispered apologies and promises that this was the last time. But those words were meaningless. The pull between us was too strong, too magnetic to resist. At first we were careful. We avoided each other in public, kept our conversations brief during church events, and made sure we were never seen alone together. But every stolen moment, every passing glance, every accidental touch, only fueled the fire. It wasn't long before we were finding excuses to be alone. It started with late nights at the church. Nathan had told me once that the building felt different after dark, quieter in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I began to understand what he meant the first time he invited me to meet him there, after everyone had left. The sanctuary was dark except for the faint glow of candles near the altar. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and incense, and the stillness was almost deafening. He was waiting for me in one of the back pews, his hands clasped together, as if in prayer. When he saw me, he stood, his expression a mix of relief and guilt. "I shouldn't have asked you to come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this alone," I replied, stepping closer. That was all it took. In the shadow of the church, beneath the stained glass windows that glinted faintly in the moonlight, we gave in to each other once again. His hands found my waist, pulling me against him as his lips captured mine in a kiss that was equal parts passion and desperation. The wooden pews creaked beneath us as he lowered me onto the bench, his body pressing against mine. The sacredness of the setting made it feel both wrong and unbearably exhilarating. "I shouldn't," he murmured against my neck, but his actions betrayed him, his touch growing more insistent with every passing moment. Neither of us spoke after that. Words felt meaningless in the face of what we were doing, what we couldn't seem to stop doing. 2 weeks later, the church hosted a weekend retreat at a small, secluded lodge in the woods. Nathan had suggested I attend, framing it as an opportunity to focus on healing and reflection. But we both knew that wasn't the real reason he wanted me there. The lodge was charming in its simplicity, with wooden beams and large windows that let in the soft glow of the autumn sun. The days were filled with group activities and quiet moments of prayer. but it was the nights that I couldn't stop thinking about. On the second evening, after the others had gone to bed, Nathan found me sitting by the fireplace in the common room. The fire cast flickering shadows across his face, making him look older, warier. "You shouldn't be here," I said as he sat down beside me, though my voice lacked conviction. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his hand brushing against mine. The others were just upstairs, their soft murmurs and footsteps occasionally audible through the wooden ceiling. The risk of being caught was dizzying, but it only seemed to heighten the tension between us. When he kissed me, it was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer until I could feel the heat of the fire on my skin. "We can't do this here," I whispered, though I made no move to stop him. "I know," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear, "but I don't care." We didn't make it far. Just outside the common room was a small storage closet, its shelves lined with supplies for the retreat. The space was cramped, the air thick and stifling, but neither of us noticed. All that mattered was the way his body pressed against mine, the way his hands explored me with a hunger that felt impossible to contain. When it was over, we leaned against each other, our breathing ragged in the suffocating heat of the closet. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, his lips lingering as if he didn't want to let go. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," he said softly. But we both knew the answer. As long as we could. The closer we grew, the harder it became to keep our relationship hidden. It wasn't just the parishioners I worried about. It was the way Nathan's demeanor seemed to shift when we were apart. He was more distant during services, his usual warmth tempered by a quiet tension. People noticed. One Sunday morning, I overheard two women whispering in the church hall after the service. "Have you seen the way he looks at her?" one of them said, her tone laced with suspicion. "It's probably nothing," the other replied, though she didn't sound convinced. My stomach tightened as I quickly walked past them, my face burning with the weight of their words. Nathan noticed the change too. One evening, as we sat together in his office, I brought it up. "People are starting to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted, "and I hate that it's putting you in this position." "It's not just me," I said softly. "It's you, your reputation, your life." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "You're worth it," he said simply. The turning point came on a rainy evening, much like the night this all began. Nathan had come to my house, his coat dripping from the downpour outside. But this time, his expression was different, more desperate, more conflicted. "I can't keep doing this," he said as he stood in my living room, his voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending like this isn't tearing me apart." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Nathan." "No," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Let me finish. I've been trying to reconcile us, with everything I thought I believed. And I can't. I can't make sense of it. But I also can't walk away." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew what he was saying, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it outright. "This isn't sustainable," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We can't keep living like this, hiding, lying." "I know," he said, his hands gripping my shoulders. "But tell me how to stop wanting you. Tell me how to let you go." I didn't have an answer. Instead, I pulled him closer, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both an apology and a plea. As the weeks went on, the weight of what we were doing became harder to ignore. Nathan's guilt was palpable, even when he tried to hide it. He started pulling away during services, avoiding my gaze, and throwing himself into his duties with a fervor that felt almost punishing. But when we were alone, the intensity between us was as undeniable as ever. It was as if we were two halves of the same storm, drawn together by forces we couldn't control. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. By the time everything started unraveling, I think we both knew it was inevitable. You can only keep secrets for so long, in a place as tightly knit as our church community. Every lingering glance, every stolen moment, every subtle shift in Nathan's demeanor, it all added up, even if most people couldn't quite put their finger on what was different. But some could. The whispers started small. A comment here, a knowing glance there. At first I tried to ignore it. After all, people love to gossip, especially when it comes to their priest. But then, I started noticing the looks. Sideways glances from some of the parishioners, polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was during a midweek Bible study group that I overheard something that sent my stomach plummeting. I had stayed after to help with cleanup when two women in the kitchen started talking in hushed tones. "I just think it's strange how much time he spends with her," one of them said, her voice low but sharp. "Well, she's been going through a hard time," the other replied, though there was a note of doubt in her voice. "Maybe he's just trying to help." "Maybe," the first one said, her words heavy with implication. "But it doesn't look good, does it?" I slipped out before they could see me, my heart pounding as their words echoed in my mind. It wasn't long before someone brought their suspicions directly to Nathan. He told me about it one evening as we sat together in my living room, the air between us thick with tension. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. "Mrs. Albright came to see me today," he said finally, his voice strained. I froze. "What did she say?" "She said people are starting to talk, that they've noticed how often we're seen together, how much attention I've been giving you." He looked up at me then, his dark eyes filled with guilt and frustration. "She told me to be careful, that I'm putting my position at risk." I felt a wave of shame wash over me. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "This is my fault." "No," he said firmly, cutting me off. "This isn't your fault. We both made this choice. But she's right. If this comes out..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We both knew what was at stake. The pressure only grew from there. Nathan became more withdrawn, throwing himself into his duties with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He started avoiding me in public, his once warm demeanor replaced with a distant professionalism that felt like a knife to the heart. But when we were alone, the intensity of his emotions boiled over. It all came to a head one night, after a particularly tense service. I'd stayed late, hoping to catch him in a quiet moment. When I found him in his office, he looked exhausted, his usual composure frayed at the edges. "We can't keep doing this," he said as soon as I walked in, his voice low and filled with anguish. I shut the door behind me, my chest tightening. "Nathan." "No," he said, standing abruptly. "Don't. You know this isn't sustainable. We're fooling ourselves if we think we can keep this up without everything falling apart." I felt my throat tighten, tears threatening to spill over. "So what are you saying? That we just stop? Like none of this ever happened?" "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what the answer is. All I know is that I can't keep living like this, torn between you and everything I've spent my life building." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For weeks, I'd been trying to ignore the reality of our situation, clinging to the fleeting moments we shared. But hearing him say it out loud forced me to confront the truth. We were living on borrowed time. "I can't lose you," I said finally, my voice trembling. He looked at me then, his expression softening, and for a moment, I thought he might take it all back. But instead, he stepped closer, his hands gripping my shoulders as he rested his forehead against mine. "You already have me," he whispered, "but I don't know if I can keep being yours." The next morning, Nathan called me. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he told me he was taking a leave of absence from the church. "I need time to think," he said, "to figure out what this means. For me, for us, for everything." I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. He needed space, and as much as it hurt, I had to give it to him. For the next week, I avoided the church altogether. The thought of walking through those doors and not seeing him there was too much to bear. But one evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Nathan was standing there, his face shadowed by the fading light. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I know one thing, I can't imagine my life without you." That night, we didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, we let our actions speak for us, the weight of everything we couldn't say hanging in the air. In the quiet intimacy of my bedroom, Nathan held me like he was afraid I might disappear. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he was trying to memorize every inch of me. When he kissed me, it was slow and deliberate, filled with a kind of longing that brought tears to my eyes. "I don't know what the future holds," he murmured against my skin. "But I know this. This is real." For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, I knew we'd face it together. The next morning, Nathan left, but not before pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead and promising that he'd return when he was ready. I didn't know what would happen next. Would he leave the priesthood? Would we find a way to make this work? Or would we be forced to let each other go? The uncertainty was agonizing, but for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Nathan had been my anchor during the darkest time of my life, and while our relationship had brought its own share of challenges, it had also shown me what it meant to feel truly alive. But I knew the hardest part was still to come. When Nathan left that morning, the house felt unbearably quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the sheets still warm where he had been, staring at the faint light filtering through the curtains. I'd known this moment was coming. From the second we crossed the line from confessional to something more, I knew it couldn't last. But knowing didn't make it easier. For the first few days, I moved through life on autopilot. I avoided the church entirely, terrified of the questions I might face, of the eyes that might linger too long with suspicion. My phone stayed silent, no calls or messages from Nathan. I didn't expect any. Whatever he was going through, he needed to face it alone. Still, the silence was deafening. I threw myself into work, filling my days with lesson plans and my evenings grading papers. But no matter how busy I tried to keep myself, my thoughts always circled back to him. I wondered what he was doing, where he had gone. Had he spoken to anyone about us? Was he at peace with his decision? Or was he wrestling with the same guilt and longing that kept me awake at night? The ache of missing him was sharper than I expected. It wasn't just the physical absence, though that was part of it. It was the loss of his presence in my life, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. And yet I couldn't bring myself to regret what we'd shared. The whispers at church didn't stop, even in Nathan's absence. If anything, they grew louder. People speculated about why he had taken leave, offering their own theories with the certainty of those who had no idea what they were talking about. "It's the stress," someone said during a women's group meeting. "Priests aren't immune to burnout, you know." "Maybe it's health-related," another offered, her voice tinged with concern. I stayed silent, my heart pounding as I listened. They didn't know the truth, but it was only a matter of time before someone pieced it together. I wondered if I should leave the church entirely, but part of me couldn't bring myself to do it. As much as I wanted to distance myself from the place that had become the backdrop to so many of our moments, it was also the place where I had found hope again. 2 weeks after Nathan left, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. "Claire, I don't know where to begin, so I'll start with the truth. I miss you. More than I can put into words. These past 2 weeks have been some of the hardest of my life, but they've also been necessary. I've spent hours praying, reflecting, trying to make sense of everything that's happened between us. I don't regret loving you. I couldn't, even if I tried. But I also know that what we've shared has come at a cost, one that neither of us can fully comprehend yet. I've spoken with the bishop. He's given me time to consider my path, to decide whether I want to continue in my role as a priest or step away to build a life outside the church. I don't have an answer yet, but I needed you to know that you are part of the reason this decision is so difficult. No matter what happens, I want you to remember this. You are extraordinary, Claire. You've shown me a kind of love and vulnerability I never thought I'd experience, and for that, I will always be grateful. Yours, Nathan. I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring as tears streamed down my face. The words were both a comfort and a dagger, a reminder of what we had and what we stood to lose. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the time we'd spent together, trying to make sense of what it all meant. Nathan hadn't just been a fleeting romance, he'd been a catalyst, a force that reminded me what it felt like to truly live. For years, I'd walked through life feeling invisible, defined by the roles I played, wife, teacher, neighbor. But with Nathan I was simply Claire. He saw me. Not for what I'd lost, but for who I was beneath it all. That kind of connection changes you. It forces you to confront the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore, to question what you want and what you're willing to sacrifice to get it. Nathan had shown me a kind of love that was as beautiful as it was flawed. And while it couldn't last, it left an indelible mark on me. Life didn't return to normal after Nathan left. It couldn't. But slowly, I began to find my footing again. I started attending a different church, one where I could slip in and out unnoticed, free from the whispers and knowing glances that followed me at St. Gabriel's. I focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life that had been broken, finding joy in small moments, a kind word from a student, the warmth of the sun on my face during an afternoon walk, the quiet satisfaction of finishing a book I'd been meaning to read for years. And while the ache of missing Nathan never fully disappeared, it began to soften, becoming a quiet hum in the background rather than an all-consuming weight. 6 months after Nathan left, I saw him again. It was a chance encounter, one I hadn't prepared for. I was sitting at a cafe downtown, sipping my coffee and reading a book, when I felt someone's presence beside me. When I looked up, there he was. He looked different, tired perhaps, but also lighter in a way I couldn't quite place. He smiled when he saw me, a soft, bittersweet smile that made my heart ache. "Hi," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "Hi," I replied, setting my book aside. We talked for a while, catching up on the months we'd spent apart. He told me he was still figuring things out, that he hadn't made any definitive decisions yet but was taking it one day at a time. When it was time to leave, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I hope you know how much you mean to me." "I do," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "And I hope you know the same." Nathan and I didn't find a way back to each other. Not in the way we had before, but that brief encounter gave me something I hadn't realized I needed. Closure. I don't know what path he chose in the end, whether he returned to the church or found a new life outside of it. But I do know that our time together wasn't wasted. Nathan showed me what it meant to love fiercely, even when it's complicated, even when it doesn't last. And in the end, that was enough. As I walked away from the cafe that day, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Life would go on, and so would I. And while Nathan and I were no longer part of each other's worlds, the love we shared would always be a part of who I was.